Okay, so the actual relationship itself, tangent, sine, and cosine, when you learn them, have to do with sides of the triangle and one angle, okay? And the tricky part is the ratio changes depending on what angle you're referring to. So if we call this triangle ACB, you should know by now that the hypotenuse is always the hypotenuse, okay? Neither of the legs would ever be referred to as the hypotenuse. The only useful part of identifying it when you're dealing with tangent is just so you don't mistakenly use that side, okay? What you're going to set up right here is an actual, doesn't look like it, but it is almost the format for the equations that you're going to set up. So we would say the tangent of an angle, which is actually a number. Once you know what the angle measure is, you can put that into your calculator and find out what the tangent of 40 degrees is, which is usually a decimal, okay? But the tangent of the angle is equal to the ratio of the opposite side, and I don't really have a lot of room for side, but opposite side over adjacent side. So you need side lengths in order to set this up. Okay, so basically we're dealing with an angle measure and two side lengths, and you're going to need to know 2 out of 3 of them to solve for anything. Okay. Now, the first thing that they have you doing is actually just writing the ratios, which is super easy. You're probably going to think you missed something because they're that easy. Okay. But when we're writing ratios, if you're using angle B or discussing angle B, then the opposite side to B would be AC. Okay? And the adjacent side to B would be BC. It can't be this one because that's the hypotenuse. We don't use the hypotenuse with tangent. Okay? So BC would be adjacent. And when we actually have side lengths, you'll see how that works. Okay? Now, if I switch and I want to talk about A, I would say the tangent of angle A. Okay? What is the opposite of angle A? Yep. BC. And then the adjacent to angle A is AC. And we'll just put a note in here, because these are just kind of in general. Simplify all ratios. Okay? So, if I ended up with 4/8, for instance, I would not leave it 4/8. I'd change it to 1/2. So, along the same lines, sometimes you'll do them and you'll have, for instance, 2.3/3.1. Okay? It's not that they necessarily share a factor, but you can't leave decimals in your ratio. You'd multiply the top and bottom by powers, or powers of 10 to move your decimals over. All right? So, now, using that with an actual triangle that has lengths, Your homework is going to ask you to write the ratio of both angles, the tangent. Okay. So if I'm talking about angle U, then I'm going to come up here to angle U and say, okay, what is the opposite? TV, and that length is 8, which is what I'm shooting for, is the length. Okay, so 8, and the adjacent for U is UV, which is 6, right? And 8 over 6 has a common factor of 2, so I'm going to simplify that, so it'd be 4 over 3. But if I'm writing the tangent of angle T, then what is the opposite for T?
6.
Yeah, opposite is 6, adjacent is 8. And that's still going to simplify, but that would be 3 over 4. Okay? No decimals for those ratios. Okay, so don't use your calculator and go, well, it's 0.75. We don't want decimal answers. Okay. So that is the easy part. The ratios are just that easy. You set them up, you simplify them, you're done. So if they ask you for a ratio, it's quick. Okay. This is this is where you get into some algebra, though. So the steps are set up the equation and solve for x. Sounds simple, but these do not necessarily look like equations that you're used to because it has a word in it. It has tan in it, okay? And you have one of 3 scenarios, basically. You're either going to have a variable in the numerator of a fraction, a variable in the denominator, or when we find angle measures, you're actually going to have a variable with a word, which makes it kind of confusing for some. Okay, so this is the first one. So when I say set up your equation, I mean take the full thing that you wrote down for tangent. Tangent of the angle equals opposite over adjacent. And that doesn't look like an equation, but it's got an equal sign. It really is. And then we're going to plug in what we have. We have the angle, right? So you're going to say the tangent of 54 equals the opposite, which would be W, over the adjacent, which is 10. Okay, now depending on what your calculator will do for you, there's different ways. And this is kind of what makes it tough, is different people have different calculators, and we kind of have to move around and make sure you understand your own calculator, okay? So not one set of instructions on the calculators work for everyone, which is part of the confusion, I think. Now, if this were 20 equals W over 10, and you were trying to get W by itself, what would you do? You'd multiply both sides by 10, okay? So let me put it this way. If your calculator lets you, usually it's a TI-30 or better, so to speak, but if your calculator shows a display, if you put in parentheses and it shows them, or you put in the radical and it shows the radical, if you type things in as you see it, you're going to be able to do this in one step, okay? You multiply both sides by 10. And the trick here is do not put the 10 with the 54 because we're not multiplying 54. We're multiplying the tangent of 54, okay? This is a number. You don't want to put the 10 into that number because you will change it, all right? So if your calculator will allow you, you do 10 tangent 54. And what you should end up with is 13.8. Okay? If you're able to do that, it's going to take you less work to use your calculator. Now,
13.8.
Yep.
I got 13.76.
We round to the nearest 10. Okay? Now, if your calculator won't do that for you, if you, for instance, if you're taking the square root of 49 and you put 49 in and have to hit the square root, then you kind of have to work backwards. So you're going to put in 54 and hit the tangent key, which will give you a decimal. And, all right, so over here, alternative. Alternative calculator steps is find the tangent of 54. Okay? So if I have tangent of 54 equals W over 10, then I can calculate this by doing 54 and hitting tangent, which is going to give me 1.376. And there's more than that, but I would keep at least, if you're going to do it this way, I would keep at least 3 decimals on that. That would be W over 10. So if you want to jot that decimal down, if you feel better about that, or if you understand it better, you can do that. Then you would multiply both sides by 10 to get W by itself. So when I multiply this by 10, I get 13.76, which should be rounded to 13.8. Okay. Now, you could leave all of this in your calculator. If you do 54, hit the tangent button, leave that decimal in there, and then multiply by 10. So you're kind of backing your way through the problem, calculator-wise, all right? Now, say you're putting that in and you're like, yep, I did all that, and I'm not getting 13.76. You need to make sure your calculator is in degrees when you do this, not radians, because radians will give you a totally different answer. So if you find that you're doing all of this and you're getting really teeny tiny numbers and they just don't make sense, check the mode. Okay. We will do one of each type from the homework, but I want to go on to what happens when your variable ends up in your denominator, because this would not be solved exactly the same.